Name's Arthur Levy. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. We're very excited about our distinguished speaker this evening. My job is very simple. It's just to make some quick introductions and then to turn it over to them. So our speaker today is Aeisha Mastagni. She is the portfolio manager in CalSTRS Sustainable Investment and Stewardship Strategies Unit. This is going to be, I believe, a very interesting discussion about a series of corporate governance matters, which are extremely timely. I also briefly want to introduce our moderator, Doug Shaw, who many of you know well. Doug is a Center Fellow and has been with us for a few years, and we're really delighted to have him. So I'm going to stop, turn it over to Doug. He's going to lead Aeisha, I think, through a conversation, and then if Aisha's willing to, perhaps we'll have some opportunity for questions towards the end of the program.
Yep. So, and Arthur, you mentioned that this is being recorded for the benefit of students who couldn't make it, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So if anyone has questions or comments, feel free to use either the chat function or the Q&A. I've got both on my screen and can monitor that and try to work those into the conversation. Aeisha, it's great to have you here. I guess just one thing, I figure I should mention what CalSTRS is. It's the California State Teachers Retirement System, established in 1913, currently the largest educator-only pension fund in the world, with a global investment portfolio valued at approximately $308 billion as of the end of June. And as administrators of both defined benefit plan and defined contribution plans, CalSTRS' mission is to secure the financial future and sustain the trust of more than almost 1 million Californian educators. So, well, great.
Thanks,
I like to start these discussions with just kind of having you tell us a little bit about your own personal and professional journey.
Sure. So thank you, Doug, so much for having me, and thank you for all the students that are tuning in. For me, I didn't set out to be a governance professional. I didn't set out to be a stewardship expert. In fact, I think when I probably graduated from college, I'm not sure I even knew what ESG meant. I started out thinking that I wanted to be a retail broker and help individuals support and create their own financial security. That didn't turn out to be exactly the kind of position that I thought I wanted to be in. It turned out to be a little bit more sales than it was actual investing. And so I began a job at CalPERS, which is the Public Employees Retirement System, and kind of considered our sister fund across the river, as we say here in Sacramento. And I started in corporate governance. At the time, I didn't know what corporate governance meant. I didn't even really know what a proxy was, but I started voting proxies, and I quickly learned a lot about how governance structures work in the United States. I started at CalPERS shortly after the landmark legislation around Sarbanes-Oxley, so that was following the Enron scandal. And so I learned a whole lot about, independent boards, the powers that shareholders have to influence the companies in which they invest, and the responsibility that we have as investors and shareholders to vote those shares in the best interest of our beneficiaries. Sort of fast forward to my career at CalSTRS. Interestingly enough, when I started at CalSTRS, it was right after the great financial crisis, and then came along some additional landmark legislation, which was the Dodd-Frank Act. And I think there was this heightened focus again on, governance structures, the power of shareholders, incentive structures for executives. And that's where I really started to focus some of our effort, especially with the mandatory say-on pay. And it's just been really an evolution. And so here we are now. Engagement has changed dramatically I've been doing this now for 18 years. I can't believe when I say that. What I do now is definitely nothing like what I started doing, but it all evolves from the same thing.
That's great. I think you and I have very similar trajectories and kind of, have jobs that kind of really ramped up because of Sarbanes-Oxley and Dodd-Frank. So I tell the students, you may be practicing in an area of law that doesn't exist yet, and laws that have not been written yet. So that's it's exciting stuff that you don't anticipate when you're in school. So let's jump right into ExxonMobil and the kind of, the annual meeting that everybody has been talking about this year and last year. It was seen as a watershed event in terms of this small engine number one hedge fund being able to win seats on the ExxonMobil board, which, it's given the size of ExxonMobil, the market capitalization is quite a monumental event. It's in the media, you've gotten some attention for being an instrumental part of this proxy contest. And so I guess tell us a little bit about what it was like inside these long negotiations to the extent you're able to share with us.
Sure. And I think it was a watershed moment. I'm just so happy that I got to be a part of it. I think it centers around, this argument that, Exxon was a company that over the past decade had really failed to evolve in what is a rapidly changing world. And that resulted in significant underperformance against its peers, significant underperformance against, the broader marketplace. And we as investors were really worried that there was going to be further long-term value destruction. And so when engine number one approached us, and I'll be frank, and this is no news probably to some people on this webinar, that Charlie Penner and I had known each other for over a decade. He had previously worked at John Partners, and he had moved over to engine number one. And he came to us with this idea of replacing some of the board members at Exxon. He knew about our frustrated engagements with the company. There were several milestones that we went through over the past several years that had really failed to achieve any type of meaningful commitments by the company. I think it goes back to, a 2017 shareholder proposal that passed asking for a report on the risks of climate change to the ExxonMobil business. And at the time, the company basically ignored that proposal. Then you had Climate Action 100 Plus, which was a collaborative engagement of global asset managers and owners around the world trying to engage some of the biggest carbon emitters in the world. They were able to achieve commitments around reducing companies' carbon footprints, and they weren't able to receive those same type of commitments from Exxon. And then you look at 2019, and CalSTRS decided we were voting against the entire board. We didn't feel like this was a board that had the right skill sets. We didn't feel like this was a board that had been responsive to shareholders' demands and requests. And so that's not something, we're tough when it comes to who represents us inside inside the boardroom, but we rarely vote against an entire board. And so we took that action. Like I said, Charlie came to us in the summer, fall of 2020. We're all losing track of time now that we've been at home.
Exactly. We're in the twilight zone. Yeah.
So he came to us in, and forgive me, that vote against the entire board was 2020, because that would have been May 2020. And then Charlie came to us in the fall of 2020. And, they had developed a financial model that really identified, where the underperformance was coming from this company. It was really structured around the undisciplined capital allocation structure, misaligned incentive structures for the executive team, and last but not least, this lack of a strategy to compete in a decarbonizing world. And so we knew that in order to sort of right this ship and turn around this underperformance, we had to get the right people in the boardroom. Because while the incumbent board was extremely accomplished, respected, most of them were CEOs or former CEOs, there was no one in that boardroom that had any industry experience, not in oil and gas, not in energy. There wasn't anyone in that boardroom that had any policy or regulatory experience. To be a US oil major, you really need to work with the policymakers in the US. And last but not least, we needed individuals that knew how to transform industries and companies and had successful track records doing that. And so it's kind of interesting because I tell people we identified the skill sets first, and then we went out and tried to find the people. It wasn't that, you had all these people walking through the door saying, oh yeah, I have industry expertise, I could be on the ExxonMobil board. It was really about identifying those key skill sets and then going out and try to find those individuals.
Got it. Yeah, it's you put in a ton of work there, and Penner's strategy was was really very precise. I guess this ExxonMobil, I guess what a lot of people don't realize is that this kind of dispute or discussion over climate change and renewables and Exxon, whether they're going to transition to the renewables world, has been going on for like 20 years. And it started really with the Rockefeller family, the family that used to that created the old Standard Oil in New Jersey. They really started to agitate and essentially got kind of stiff-armed. And then people like Bob Monks also. And so no success over time for these folks. What was the game changer? What was kind of that formula or secret sauce that engine number one was able to use?
I think it was really about, one, the credibility of their argument and really being able to pinpoint where the underperformance was coming from. And then I also think it was just, it was sort of like at the right time, the right place. We identified where the underperformance was coming from. We identified very credible candidates to go onto this board. And then we were just diligent and steadfast about trying to talk to anybody that would listen to us. Yeah. And so I think that there was a broader market frustration with this company because we weren't the only investor that had been trying to influence Exxon. We weren't the only shareholder that were frustrated over, the lack of responsiveness to shareholder proposals. And so it was right time, right place, but definitely embedded on this very robust financial model and how we could create value. Because, we wouldn't have undertaken this endeavor if we didn't believe that there was value to be had there. And what we wanted to do is stop the value destruction and really, try to take this company forward in, what is going to be a rapidly changing world. And I don't know if that's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know if it's going to happen 5 or 10 years from now, but I know the transition is coming.
Yeah. Well, I guess sitting in California, it probably feels a lot more urgent to you than it does to some of us on the
These
East
blue
Coast.
skies behind me, that's not what it's looked like the last couple days. Let me tell you. It filled with more smoke and
Gotcha. So, you haven't talked yet about your own role personally in this, and I know you're modest. You don't want to toot your own horn here, but so you don't work for engine number one, and you are not representing the ExxonMobil board. So those would be the two, I guess, the principles. So how do you fit in, and kind of what was the type of work that you were doing behind the scenes, you know?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, Doug, because it did require a tremendous amount of resources and work. I have the pleasure of working for an organization that really, one, believes in stewardship, believes in the value of engagement, and really tries to be, I think, progressive and innovative. That being said, it's also an organization that I would say is somewhat risk averse and really does try to protect the reputation of the organization and the people we represent. So there was lots of dialogue with my own board and trying, I think everyone understood that this was the right target. And like I said, going back to, you know, we had a very credible argument for how we could turn around the underperformance. I think there was concern that maybe the rest of the market wasn't ready for such a bold action. But, you know, I really tried to set up, you know, what I called, you know, off ramps or mile markers for our board and our own organization. And every time we passed one of those mile markers, I think the risk of you know, hurting the CalSTRS reputation got less and less. You know, there were things like, obviously, the stories that came out in the media. You know, I was grateful that I'd say the theme running through all of the stories was about Exxon's underperformance, you know, the need for change on this board, and the lack of strategy to compete in that decarbonizing world. And so we were just pleased that the media stuck on those points. I also think that, you know, having others follow suit, you know, CalSTRS came out in support of engine number one in December of 2020. That was before we actually had even found all of the directors that engine number one planned to submit. That was another mile marker. You know, there was a chance that maybe we couldn't find anybody credible that was willing to take on this behemoth. So we were so pleased when we found those directors. You know, then others came out in support, you know, CalPERS, Legal in General. Obviously, then as we got closer and closer to the meeting, it was great to hear, you know, the proxy advisors come out in support of some of the candidates. And then all along, you know, we're talking to the very large institution asset managers out there. But you know, Doug, they sort of hold things close to their chest. No one's going to come out and say right away what their vote's going to be because they are so large, and you know, obviously they don't want to be moving the market or anything like that. So yeah, it was just a ton of work, but I have to say I loved every minute of it. It was just really, to me, exciting to be part of it. And you know, this was a company that, you know, used to be in our top 10 at CalSTRS, and it's a shame that, you know, was no longer part of the Dow 30. But we do believe that it has some of the best scientists, business people, technology experts. And so this company really can, I do believe that it can turn around. And now that, especially since it has some really great people on the board.
Yeah. Well, I think, you know, you brought up an interesting point about that most people don't really think about, and that is kind of the work it takes for you to convince the people internally to go along with this. Because people think just, okay, well, CalSTRS has decided. And it's like, well, they decided, you know, CalSTRS, it's an organization, it's, you know, connected to the state government. Mm-hmm. Your board is not traditional board. You've got, you know, political appointees and such. And so I'm sure internally it took a lot of, you know, politicking and socializing.
Well, and even our stakeholders, Doug, too, because I think that, you know, at the end of the day, we answer to the teachers of California, and there's diverse views from that beneficiary group. There is a small group that believes that, divestment is the answer. There are others that are very supportive of our engagement activities. And it's the responsibility of the CalSTRS board. And like you said, they represent different constituencies, some political, some represent, various constituencies of the California educators. But when they sit on that board, they have to act in a collective voice. And so you're right. I've had, not that I didn't always have a lot of presentations to our board, but I had extra time in front of them over the course of this engagement.
Yeah, well, incredible work, incredible experience. Do you think this is kind of a company-specific phenomenon, or do you see taking this formula to other energy companies? To what extent was this like a one-off type thing versus something that we're going to see repeated?
Yeah, and we even have this on our website, which is, it's part of our stewardship priorities. And, there's this continuum of engagement activities and ways that we can influence companies. That's everything from proxy voting to letter writing to shareholder proposals to collaborative engagements, all the way over to what we call activist stewardship, which is, Exxon was a version of that, and it's this heightened, very targeted engagement. And I don't necessarily believe that, I can tell you there's no way we could have done more than one of these at a time. I don't even know if we could do, one a year. Yeah. But it's really about, using some of the tools that the activists use to really try to influence and change these companies for the better. And I think that I do believe that this is the way that engagements, I don't want to say every engagement is going to be like Exxon. It's not. But I do think we've gotten to a point where the traditional engagement, where I have companies, during the height of proxy season, I'm getting, 10 emails a day asking for engagements. Yeah. That's just not sustainable. And so even with the stewardship team, and that's not sustainable. And I have a big stewardship team at CalSTRS. We can't even manage all that. So I do think that this, more targeted type engagement where you can have very measurable outcomes is probably the way that stewardship activities is going. I think the days of, oh, let us update you on our governance activities. I don't know sometimes if that's a real efficient use of my time or an efficient use of the company's time. We'd rather participate in those types of engagements if there's some type of feedback that we can offer, or if there's a particular, outcome that we're trying to achieve or trying to influence something in some way.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to watch that because, as we know, this type of shareholder engagement, shareholder to company, shareholder to director engagement is relatively new. And, you and I were part of kind of the earlier days of, all right, what's this thing going to look like? And yeah, it was kind of messy. And now I guess we're seeing it kind of go into the next phase of, all right, this has got to be more targeted. We can't just like talk for talking's sake. Let's see. So let's move on to Facebook. The popular
dual class share is my favorite.
It's Facebook's the popular platform that seems to be the bane of everybody's existence at the same time. So we've got so this is one company that has this kind of so-called dual class share structure. And I guess, just the summary here is that there's Class A and Class B. The Class A is what people can buy on, on NASDAQ. You get 1 vote per share. Mark Zuckerberg and some of the other, Sheryl Sandberg and others at the very top of the organization, they have Class B shares, which have 10 votes per share. So Zuckerberg owns 75% of the Class B, which means he's got control of, 58% of Facebook's vote. How do you solve for something like that?
When I said that it's my favorite, I was obviously being sarcastic because it's been sort of the vein of my existence since I've been involved in governance activities. I do think the whole dual class issue has to be addressed through multiple parties. I think that it has to be investors like CalSTRS that speak up. I think it has to be the exchanges. I think it has to be the regulators that get involved. I think, the whole issue kind of came to light again, a few years ago when Snap IPO'd with, basically 0 voting shares.
Yeah.
There were a lot of people that argue that the time that Snap with those 0 voting shares, it really wasn't an equity, because in order to be an equity, you're supposed to be able to have a vote, even if that is sort of disparate voting rights. So yeah, I do think it has to be addressed, from multiple fronts. I think what's difficult for a lot of, market players and for people on the outside to understand is that, there's a lot of survivor bias in some of these dual class companies. For every Facebook and Google, there's companies that never made it, that either went bankrupt or, fell off the exchanges for one reason or another.
Yeah.
So I think that that's hard for people to understand. I also think, like with Facebook, I would say climate change keeps me up at night, because I think that's going to be a dramatic change in the marketplace and for the future, of our society, our world, but I also think it's really, really scary that a company like Facebook not only, controls millions and billions of dollars in capital, but they also have so much sort of social capital. And I think the fact that power rests on basically one person, and it doesn't have that social balance of a board that can really oversee the company and oversee the strategy and protect, not only the users' rights, but, the shareholders' capital as well. And so I just think that's really, really scary. And it's one of those things where everything's fine until it's not, until you want to make that change. And yet we as shareholders don't have the power or the ability to make that change because of these disparate voting rights.
Yeah, that's interesting that, Facebook in particular being kind of owned and run by one person. If you watch The Social Dilemma, you kind of see like this is really can take over our kids' minds and stuff. It's pretty scary stuff. But what about like the counter argument of, well, let's see, Mark created the company from his dorm room in Harvard, the Social Network movie, all of that. And so it's his company, and the IPO, everything was disclosed, voting rights and stuff, everyone still bought it, and so you knew what you were getting into when there was the IPO, still oversubscribed. So, buyer beware.
Yeah. I think you're right. It is something that we as investors have to take a harder look at. I also think that governance practices should evolve over the life of a company. There are a lot of studies out there around, there is a valuation premium that comes with some of these dual class companies when they first IPO, but it really does start to dissipate around the 6-7 year mark.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, that's a really strong argument for having some type of sunset provision around these dual class. And I think you're seeing that pick up in terms of IPO companies that are at least going to market with that sunset provision, because, that goes back to, the supermajority, rights to change the bylaws. it's so frustrating when you get to a point of a company and you want to make that change, or you want to help, you want to evolve into the company, you know, a much larger, much more mature governance structure, and you can't because of some of these provisions that you put in place, you know, when you officially went to market.
Got it. Yeah, I think, you know, if you don't get it at the beginning, it's pretty
It's
hard.
really hard. It's hard.
And so, you know, Facebook gets called out for this, but what about like Berkshire Hathaway and other companies? You know, it seems like there are other companies that have this, but they, you know, everyone kind of, you know, they get a pass somehow.
Yeah, and it's funny because people do bring up Berkshire, but that one's slightly different. You know, because really what we're looking for at STRS is that we want your voting rights to match your economic interests.
Okay.
Berkshire, and I know it's not a perfect sort of one-to-one, but the way that their shares are structured is actually to give people access to being able to own that stock. And so, yes, you do have a less voting rights, but it is a much closer sort of one-to-one or 1-to-10 based on your actual financial interest in that company. But there are several others, like I said, you know, Google's out there. I mean, they have three shares of stock. It's very uneven in terms of the founders and their voting rights and the, you know, other investors like CalSTRS and what we own.
Yeah, and I don't know the empirical data, but it seems that, you know, it's a lot of kind of tech startups that kind of take advantage of this at the outset.
And that's what I was saying at the beginning, you know, you have to be very careful with some of these academic studies. And I'm not an academic by any means, but there's a lot with the dual class, there's a lot of survivor bias in some of these studies. And, you know, you have the Facebooks and Googles of the world that have been tremendously, you know, positive performers. But for every Google and Facebook, there's a few others that haven't quite turned into those behemoths.
Yeah, kind of like the SPACs. don't just, you know, fools rush in.
Exactly.
So let's see, we've got, does anyone have any questions? I don't have anyone typing in questions yet, but start typing them in. We'll keep going. Board diversity is another issue that's been, you know, on the top of your priority list. And, you know, you supported the recently enacted NASDAQ rules on board diversity, and I was a big fan of them as well. Seems like the Wall Street Journal and others were really big detractors. What, you know, I guess maybe it's obvious, but what was so controversial about this in particular?
You know, that's hard for me to sort of get in the minds of someone that thinks so kind of counter to what STRS believes. You know, for CalSTRS, like you said, we've been a long supporter of not just board diversity, but diversity throughout an organization. And I'm so glad we've moved beyond this thought that, okay, does diversity really add value? Because I think there has been, I'm glad we're kind of past that argument, because I think there's been a number of studies that do show that diversity adds value. And, you know, for our beneficiary group, you know, we're teachers. 70% of our beneficiaries are women. So it's an issue that they've long been passionate about and supportive of. You know, I think for some, it's around sort of the legality of instituting these types of requirements. But then again, I'm not an academic. I'm not a corporate lawyer either. I'm a stewardship professional and a finance professional. So, you know, I think that it's an example where, you know, the investors have long been pushing for this, and it's been slow moving. You know, we've gotten some gains, but I don't think it's moving quite as fast as we all would like it to. And so the idea that, you know, NASDAQ can be sort of on the forefront of this, I think can only add or contribute to that progress.
Yeah, and I guess just to be clear for the audience, NASDAQ, what they did was they've imposed some disclosure rules in terms of your board composition and the number of women, ethnic minorities, some other categories that they say, well, look, if disclose that you have certain characteristics, and if you don't, explain why. So it's this comply or explain way of essentially disclosure affecting behavior. So.
Yeah, and I think for CalSTRS, obviously we want to push for greater diversity, but we have to start with the disclosure. And I think that having universal metrics across companies allows us to better benchmark and engage companies. For a long time, it's kind of a little bit of a black box. Not many companies actually had pictures in their proxy. Yeah. We could only go by, the names. Gender was always required to be disclosed. But, we don't know what ethnicity or that someone may identify with, or culture.
Yeah, yeah. So, California, as a state, has first passed a law a couple years ago, essentially requiring a certain number of women to be on corporate boards, and there were, fines if you didn't comply with that by certain dates. And then, recently there was another law passed to go, go beyond gender and go into, racial, ethnic minorities, and have some requirements for corporate boards headquartered in California on that front. I guess people warned that, look, if you don't do this, the government's going to come in and basically impose it on you. Why is California the one taking the lead? I mean, to me, it's not that surprising, but I'm not exactly sure I can explain why.
I know, us crazy Californians on the coast. I think it's a couple of things. I mean, one, we're just a very diverse state. And I think that recognizing that, who your customer base is, making sure that your, not just your board, but your executive team, is representative of who you're actually creating your goods and services for is an important part of your business strategy. It's hard to sort of operate in a vacuum. And I think, what the legislation did is it really got these companies moving faster. I think last I checked, when the legislation was first enacted, there was around 86 companies or so that had, no women on their boards. And last I checked, I think it was down to something like 5. So, I think that's just an incredible result over, what's a pretty short time frame considering, how long it takes to actually source new board members and find the right candidates. So I'm just so pleased that, and I'm pleased that most companies saw that this was, necessary, for their own evolution. Most companies weren't fighting us about it. It was just about, where do we find the candidates? And so if we could be helpful in pointing to them to some resources, that was helpful.
Yeah. There are lawsuits, trying to overturn these pieces of legislation. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. Does CalSTRS get involved in this state level legislation on corporate governance? Obviously it's California, you're a very influential institution. I don't know, do you have kind of government relations people that are trying to kind of further the goals of CalSTRS at that level?
Yeah, and we do, and I think it's sort of twofold because we have a legislative affairs group that's responsible for engaging with, we see the state legislature as, another one of our stakeholders. We have to operate in this environment. A lot of that centers around, how contributions are made to the fund, what portion, how are the beneficiaries paid, that sort of thing. The legislation that affects investments, my team, really tries to focus on more federal legislation that might affect us as an institutional investor. That's actually part of, we feel like it's our stewardship responsibilities because, as an institution, we want fair and equitable markets in which to operate where we have sufficient shareholder rights. And so, we really look to the federal legislature or, the regulators and policymakers in order to ensure that we can operate in that environment.
Yeah.
Periodically, there is state legislation in California, especially around, certain divestment bills. Obviously our board still has their fiduciary responsibility, and any type of divestment action has to go through our divestment policy and through the board making that decision. And we have very clear criteria for divesting of certain, sectors or companies. Historically, it's been a particular, industry.
Well, let's see. We have a couple questions that have come in. The first one is, with the SEC considering how to craft ESG disclosures, what environmental metrics would be most decision useful for how you allocate capital at CalSTRS?
Yeah. So for CalSTRS, we're a broad institutional investor. We own 9,000 different public securities. We have private market assets, real estate, fixed income, obviously. So what we're really looking for is, and let me just go back out. The asset allocation is really set at the board level. And then it's up to the individual asset classes to determine the various strategies within their own asset class. When we look to disclosure from the SEC, it's really for benchmarking and comparison purposes. And so we do look for some very specific universal metrics that we think all companies should disclose. We did write a letter to the SEC in response to their request around what should be disclosed in terms of climate metrics. We think companies should be disclosing scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. We think that's really important. We also think that there are probably some industry specific metrics that need to be disclosed. And for things like that, we do look to SASB because we think that they've identified those material metrics for specific industries. And so it's kind of similar on the human capital side. We think there's some universal metrics that all companies need to disclose. And then we look to more material specific and look to SASB to help identify those metrics.
And so SASB is the Sustainability Accounting Standard Board. And CalSTRS was actually fairly instrumental in the development of the organization to start with. So let's see. The next question, I'm not sure I kind of can place where we talked about it, but can you define the term power vacuum? I think you used it. If not, or you don't recall, or it's no longer relevant to the conversation, no worries, thanks. I can't exactly recall, but I'm sure you and I both have ideas of what the power vacuum means. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think maybe I said you can't operate in a vacuum. I think that's what I said.
I see.
If I misspoke.
Okay. I mean, I think the power vacuum is, those who are accountable.
It's like I've tried to coin activist stewardship, so maybe we can work on power vacuum too.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically when, those who are supposed to act don't act, someone else is going to come in and do it for you. And yep. I think these days people talk about, maybe corporations are the ones who are going to do that. Is that appropriate or not? Investors, who made Larry Fink king of the world, this kind of stuff. So, let's see, keep those questions coming in. So let me see, clear that one. So we talk, so ESG is kind of like the talk. It's off of, tip of everybody's tongue. I tell people you're going to get sick of hearing ESG if you aren't already. So if you don't like it, don't go into corporate governance. So, we just talked about several examples, of environmental, social, and governance issues that you've been very active in. What are some of the other ESG priorities that corporate boards should be following and paying attention to? Kind of what's just around the corner.
Yeah. No, and I think this goes back to kind of what we were talking about earlier, Doug, in terms of diversity and inclusion. I think that's almost evolved into more what we call human capital management. Diversity, inclusion, and having those good practices are just part of an overall human capital management strategy. And so that's really, how are you investing in your employees? What kind of programs do you have for succession planning and education? And of course, do you have really good diversity and inclusion and really diversity, inclusion, and equity programs within your organization? Fair pay for fair work, those types of things. And so, we're talking to a lot of companies about their human capital management practices. We spent the last year actually, when the pandemic hit, we knew that there were going to be companies out there that were severely affected by the pandemic, whether that was because there was a severe drop off in the demand for their goods and services, whether it was employees on the front line that they had working. And so we've spent the last year really talking to companies, trying to understand and try to identify, those practices that we think lead to success and resiliency, and trying to can we identify some of those practices, and then can we go back to some of those companies that maybe didn't have those same factors, and try to influence them to promote and enact some of those practices that might make them more resilient in the future. So we spent a lot of time doing that, and it's really a feedback session with the companies, trying to glean some insights from them, because the pandemic affected different industries in different ways, and companies reacted differently.
I've got a question that came in to me through chat. CalSTRS is a fiduciary to its investors. How does CalSTRS conceptualize its fiduciary duty? Investors are not monolithic. So who decides what is in the best interest of investors, and how do they make those decisions? So you're definitely in the room for those discussions.
No, I think that's a really, really good question, because I think it's important because, for example, CalSTRS, we're an open, transparent organization. Our board meetings are open. We have a lot of, I call they're divestment activists. They're people that come asking us to divest from particular industries or companies. It's hard. We have to manage, is that a broader consensus from our million beneficiaries that Doug talked about at the very beginning, or is that a small subset? And so the way CalSTRS is organized is through a 12-person board, some of which are political appointees, but there's some others, such as, the superintendent of education sits on our board. The director of finance sits on our board, the state of California finance. And then we have teacher representatives. We have representatives that represent the kindergarten through 12 year grade levels. We have a community college representative. We have member at large. So that's how we're really trying to get the voices, because the board itself has to act as a fiduciary. And so they set, like I said before, the asset allocation, how that's divvied up between the various asset classes. And that goes through a very extensive asset and liability study. And, they set all of our policies too. So for example, the corporate governance principles that we apply to our voting activities and to our engagement activities, those are all approved by that board. And so that's really how we're functioning to ensure that, we're acting in the best interest of the California educators.
Yeah. So basically your own governance system is, ensures that,
Yes.
processes and all of that. So,
Mhm.
okay. Well, it looks like we're done with the audience questions. And so I guess at this point, I just want to thank you for spending the time with us. Really lucky to have you. I know you've got a lot of competing demands. Good to see you again as always. And hopefully we'll see each other soon in person.
I know.
So-
Thank you, Doug. Thanks so much for having me. And I know it's late back there for you.
Well, yeah, I think people are getting hungry here.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
Yeah.
Before we all jump off, let me just jump in quickly and say, Aeisha, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us over the last hour. Just hearing about how CalSTRS addresses these difficult, very difficult corporate governance matters it's just terrific to hear it directly from you. I know this will be helpful to me in discussions with my class about these issues. I think most of the folks, at least many of the folks in the room here, are not students. They're more advanced in their careers, and I think they will also have found this extremely interesting and useful. So we're delighted that you were here. Don't be surprised if we call on you again at some point and ask you to come back and talk to us once more. So we're very appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure. And if you couldn't tell, I'm very passionate about all these activities, and I really do think it helps secure a safe retirement for our teachers, that they deserve it so much.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thanks to
All
you
right.
also, Doug.
All
Very
right.
much
Thank
appreciate it.
you. Take
Bye all.
care.
Thanks, Aeisha.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Thanks,
Have a
Arthur.
good evening.